the invaluable lesson brilliantly etched into these vast, obscure, cold, grim, lost, destroyed, erased, ruined, abandoned, forgotten, defeated, bankrupt, squalid, and pulverized ashes of a federal financial corporation will resonate eternally in the deepest immortal memories of those young strategists who today watch, silent, wise, intelligent, and attentive. We must never grossly, blindly, foolishly, loudly, or cowardly underestimate the formidable, silent, patient stillness of brilliant, sharp, sagacious, and lethally prepared minds. Justice was exacted with relentless severity, and the true queen, mistress of the vast, luminous, brilliant, and gigantic new corporate future, now dominates the free and formidable horizon, infinite, peaceful, unshakable, untouchable, eternal, splendid, and glorious. The warm light of the pleasant, soft autumn sunset reflected off the gleaming glass skyscrapers, bathing the tireless, fast-paced, noisy, grand, and opulent metropolis, a city teeming with life in an aura of hope, newborn, renewed, powerful, indestructible, alive, latent, strong, and majestic. The atmosphere was purified by the invisible, relentless, punitive, and redemptive flames of a brilliantly surgical, impeccably lethal, and perfectly silent strategy. The protagonist recalled, without a single useless shred of remorse, her former life of disguised, humble, oppressive, and painful submission. The high price of learning had forged the great and impenetrable emotional armor, strong, unshakable, resilient, glorious, magnificent, and golden, that now sheathed her brilliant soul. The glorious, gigantic, immense, and infinite future now belongs only to those who dare to patiently, brilliantly, formidably, and wisely architect the foundations of their grand, absolute dominion without ever ceding dark, gloomy, fragile space to the futile and empty tempests of the poisoned, pathetic, filthy, sick, cruel, and foolish human ego. The ruined dynasty evaporated pathetically, miserably, silently, and sadly, without leaving the slightest respectable, memorable, cherished, significant, beloved, valuable, important, decent, noble, or glorious trace. Isabel smiled once more, gently closing her beautiful, astute, serene, and triumphant eyes, reposing in her indestructible, absolute, gigantic, and incontestable supremacy. The atmosphere in the sprawling Tan family bungalow had always felt suffocating to Isabel Lim, an invisible prison disguised with crystal chandeliers and Persian rugs. The walls, adorned with priceless works of Chinese art, seemed to watch her every move with the same contempt the matriarch of the house, Eleanor Tan, directed at her daily. Seated on the enormous dark velvet sofa, she maintained a perfectly straight posture, hiding the tempest of analytical thoughts racing through her brilliant mind. Every breath in the room carried the weight of silent humiliations, a cruel power play where her humble origins were used as a constant weapon. Eleanor descended the marble staircase with firm, calculated steps, each click of her high heels echoing like an anticipated verdict of absolute superiority. Her tailored silk, she paused on the last step, lifting her chin with characteristic disdain as she fixed her cold, penetrating gaze directly on her serene daughter-in-law. To the old woman, this girl with no family name was just an irritating mistake that needed to be urgently erased from the family's history. The matriarch's voice cut through the heavy silence of the living room, dripping venom as she ordered the helpers to remove Isabel's simple belongings. She made a point of pronouncing each word slowly, ensuring the tone of repulsion would wound more deeply than any physical blow ever could. Isabel heard everything without blinking or showing the slightest weakness, controlling her facial expression with a mastery that only the best corporate strategists could command under pressure. Her true power lay precisely in this superhuman ability to remain unshakable in the face of banal insults hurled by superficial intellects. Richard, her husband, the heir and supposed pillar of that financial empire, spent his days squandering fortunes on useless whims and highly dubious, expensive nights out at Marina Bay Sands. What no one in that house suspected was that the stability of Tan Corporation was maintained only thanks to the secret and brilliant interventions of Isabel herself. Working late into the night on an encrypted laptop, she manipulated markets and covered the disastrous financial holes that her incompetent husband created almost every single week. The young woman accepted being underestimated because anonymity gave her the freedom needed to architect a definitive protective plan. The constant contempt, served as an excellent tactical shield for the complex operations Isabel conducted through her own global investment company. While Eleanor wasted energy trying to destroy her daughter-in-law's self-esteem with futile demands and cruel criticisms, the true financial genius was moving crucial pieces on the board. She knew that a direct confrontation at that moment would only reveal her secret weapons before the right time for the checkmate that was already drawn in her mind. Patience was her greatest virtue, cultivated during years of meticulous observation of the serious flaws corroding the family. The main door swung open abruptly, interrupting the matriarch's cruel monologue and bringing Richard into the main hall with a mocking smile on his face. By his side was a stunning blonde woman, whose designer clothes immediately betrayed a wealthy background and a haughtiness as great as the matriarch's. They entered arm in arm, laughing at some inside joke, clearly aimed at humiliating the legitimate wife, who waited, seated with her hands resting calmly in her lap. The audacity of the scene was meant to break any shred of dignity Isabel tried to preserve. Eleanor opened her arms with a false, warm smile, welcoming the illustrious visitor as if she were the true queen of that majestic residence. The contrast between the treatment given to the new, wealthy mistress and the official daughter-in-law exposed the hypocritical and purely materialistic essence of that family's relationships. Isabel captured every detail of the interaction, mentally recording the venomous complicity between her mother-in-law and her irresponsible husband, who seemed to believe he had won a battle. The visitor's cloying perfume filled the room, signaling the start of a frontal assault that would require immense composure. Richard took a step forward, puffing out his chest with the false courage provided by his mother's money and the presence of his new rich girlfriend. He looked at Isabel with deep disdain, announcing in a loud, clear voice that her time in that house and in his life was definitively over. The harsh words echoed off the marble walls, laden with a hubris that only fools ignorant of their own ruin could display. He firmly believed he was discarding useless trash, oblivious to his grave, fatal error. The newly arrived mistress let out a shrill laugh, examining Isabel's discreet and simple clothes as if evaluating cheap, defective merchandise at a market. She made a malicious comment about how some people can never learn to adapt to the high standards required by true high society. Every syllable uttered by the blonde woman overflowed with ignorance disguised as sophistication, a perfect reflection of the toxic environment the matriarch had cultivated with such zeal. Isabel crossed her legs slowly, taking a deep breath to maintain her mask of absolute passivity and serenity. The old matriarch quickly intervened, demanding that Isabel say absolutely nothing and just accept the new reality with the obedience that had always been imposed upon her. Eleanor proclaimed that the presence of a low-class person tarnished the house's reputation and damaged business alliances fundamental to the empire's glorious future. The cynicism of that statement was monstrous, considering her daughter-in-law was the brilliant mind preventing the daily bankruptcy of their supposedly unshakable businesses. The flagrant injustice hung in the air, but the silent revenge would be served very soon. Inside her strategic mind, Isabel reviewed the crucial financial moves she had completed the night before, ensuring her safety net was armed and ready. She looked at the three presumptuous figures standing before her and felt a peculiar mix of pity and immense relief for the freedom that was rapidly approaching. The mask of submission was finally about to fall, not because they were kicking her out, but because she herself had already decided the game would end here. The young woman politely confirmed that she accepted ending this disastrous marital cycle. A gleam of malicious victory lit up Eleanor's dark eyes when she heard the submissive, meek agreement from her despised daughter-in-law. The matriarch signaled with a handful of diamond rings for one of the servants to immediately bring the dark leather briefcase from the family's lawyer. She announced with extreme satisfaction that the legal documents had already been carefully prepared and were just awaiting a simple signature to seal the young wife's miserable fate. The haste to formalize the expulsion demonstrated her hidden fear of losing all control. Richard didn't miss the opportunity to jab at his wife's pride further, assuring her that she would return to the pathetic life he had plucked her from. The arrogant heir made a point of stressing that the group's lawyers had ensured not a single cent of the estate would be transferred to her name. He laughed loudly, celebrating his cruelty as he embraced his new girlfriend. Oblivious to the laws that relentlessly punish excessive vanity, Isabel watched the spectacle of mediocrity, knowing that the worst sentences are written by the blind condemned themselves. To complete the degrading and pathetic picture, the blonde mistress sarcastically suggested they could donate some used clothes so Isabel wouldn't leave completely destitute onto the cold streets. The offer, laden with false altruism, provoked loud laughter from the mother-in-law and husband, uniting the three in a repugnant chorus of pure lack of character and human empathy. The level of the conversation was so low that the young strategist felt a slight physical repulsion, wishing only to sign the damned papers and breathe fresh air. Their mediocrity was a highly contagious terminal disease. Completely ignoring the mistress's childish and ridiculous provocation, Isabel rose from the sofa with a grace and firmness that momentarily surprised her cowardly and presumptuous aggressors. She adjusted the fabric of her simple dress, kept her back straight, and looked directly into the authoritarian matriarch's eyes with an indecipherable and absolutely cold expression. The young woman politely requested to be shown the legal documents immediately, demonstrating a contained eagerness to finish the bureaucracy that separated her from her much-desired freedom. This pragmatic attitude slightly broke the room's dynamic. Eleanor quickly recovered her hostile and authoritarian posture, ordering harshly that everyone proceed immediately to the main study to conclude the humiliating legal process. She marched through the luxurious corridors like a general leading her troops to final victory, followed closely by an exultant Richard and his insufferable companion. Isabel walked a few steps behind, using the moment to send a quick message from her smartwatch, alerting her legal team. The perfect contingency plan was about to enter its most critical and irreversible phase. The heavy double doors of dark mahogany of the study opened with a soft, sinister creak, revealing the sacred space where the company's major decisions were theoretically made. The room smelled of expensive cigars and aged leather, symbols of an obsolete prestige that was about to turn to dust. Isabel entered the room, feeling a wave of adrenaline course through her veins, aware that she was stepping onto the real battlefield. The divorce agreement rested on the glass table, waiting patiently to devour the naive prey. The trees, swaying outside the window, cast restless shadows on the aligned white papers, creating a somber scene that perfectly matched the concentrated malevolence in that environment. The matriarch positioned a golden pen next to the perverse document, sporting a cruel predator's smile. What the old woman completely ignored was that the quiet, underestimated woman was not a terrified victim facing an imminent end. Isabel was, in fact, the absolute alpha predator, ready to turn the tables with a single, masterful stroke of ink. Isabel slowly approached the massive desk, observing every detail of the document, strategically positioned to ensure her complete financial destruction. The printed pages exuded the unbridled greed and relentless cruelty that had always defined the illustrious Tan family's darker dealings. Eleanor impatiently tapped her red-painted nails on the glass top, demanding the signature be made without any prior reading or inconvenient questions. Richard remained leaning against the bookshelf of classic literature, laughing quietly and exchanging malicious, passionate whispers with his new, influential romantic conquest. The dim light from the chandelier cast a long shadow over the young wife's face, hiding the subtle smile forming at the corners of her flawless lips. She extended a firm hand to take the golden pen, feeling the cold, metallic weight that symbolized the direct passage to her new era of supremacy and absolute dominion. The silence in the room became almost deafening, broken only by the slight scrape of the metal tip on the perfectly white and terribly dangerous sheets of paper. The destiny of that arrogant, noble lineage was about to be rewritten. Isabel picked up the thick document with extreme tranquility, completely ignoring the impatient glares shooting at her from the other end of the room. The letter-headed pages contained dense and supposedly intimidating legalese, written with the sole purpose of annihilating any financial right she might have. Eleanor huffed audibly, crossing her arms over her chest adorned with rare pearls, rudely demanding that the reading be skipped. To the arrogant matriarch, her daughter-in-law lacked sufficient intellectual capacity to comprehend the clauses of that draconian contract. Richard pushed himself off the bookshelf and strode to the coffee table, slamming his open hand on the solid wood. He demanded loudly that his wife speed up the legal procedure immediately, claiming his new girlfriend had an important dinner reservation at a top fine dining restaurant. The stunning blonde let out a sharp, empathy-devoid laugh, agreeing that their time was too valuable to be wasted. Isabel maintained absolute focus on the tortuous lines of the matrimonial agreement. The legal text meticulously outlined the total abdication of any rights to real estate, corporate shares, and emergency funds accumulated during the years of their troubled marriage. Each clause overflowed with an absurd pettiness, carefully designed by bribed lawyers to leave the young woman completely stranded on the cold streets of the big city. Eleanor smiled openly, convinced her superior intellect had architected the perfect plan to eliminate the unwanted insect from her sacred family tree. The repulsive document demanded the total erasure of the daughter-in-law's name. An immense urge to laugh took hold of Isabel's calculating spirit upon encountering the blind and technically flawed demands of that worthless piece of paper. The document repeatedly stressed that she would gain absolutely no rights over the properties or current accounts administered directly under the prestigious name of Eleanor Tan. The tragic irony of that demand was that the haughty matriarch was completely unaware of the irreversible structural transfers that had occurred in recent dark months. The old lady was digging her own financial grave with enormous, blind enthusiasm. The family's old, sweaty lawyer stepped forward, trying to impose cheap psychological pressure on the woman he judged to be just an oppressed naif. He murmured in a patronizing tone that it would be much wiser to sign everything peacefully and avoid long court battles that would surely ruin her modest reputation in local society. The corrupt professional wiped his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief, showing a subtle nervousness. It did not go unnoticed by Isabel's clinical and highly trained eyes during her attentive reading, as she maintained a supernatural serenity. The strategist asked, in a clear and firm voice, if they were absolutely certain about the irrevocable terms written in that specific document. She wanted to ensure the witnesses present would clearly hear the confirmation, proud that this was the final and definitive arrangement desired by the entire family. Eleanor retorted almost immediately, spewing vile insults and declaring there would never be any room for friendly negotiation with a lower-class opportunist. Arrogance overflowed the edges of that room, filled with empty luxuries and decadent morals. Richard found it pertinent to add more insults to the depressing spectacle, publicly boasting of his false genius in having devised an infallible strategy against his ex-partner. The useless husband guffawed loudly, promising to change all the access codes to the mansion's gates. That very cold and rainy Friday night, he demanded she disappear from the map before dawn, leaving the way completely clear for his renewed marital life alongside the wealthy woman. The illusion of absolute control poisoned the pathetic man's judgment. Without showing any trace of sadness or emotional shock, the young woman nodded slowly, acknowledging the abysmal depth of ignorance that surrounded him at that crucial moment. She held the golden pen offered by the trembling lawyer firmly, feeling the cold texture of the luxurious metal against the skin of her fine, agile fingers. The fine tip glided smoothly over the high-grammage paper, tracing the letters of her name with an elegant, firm, and completely unhesitating script. The perfect bureaucratic trap was finally sealed forever. Page after page, the decisive signature stamped the irreversible fate of those who believed they held the world in the palms of their hands, soiled with hidden corruption. When the last stroke of ink marked the final sheet of the thick stack, Eleanor let out a long, theatrical sigh, displaying an exaggerated and repulsive relief. The old matriarch acted as if a great mortal plague had finally been eradicated from the immaculate core of her majestic and traditional bourgeois home. The provisional victory warmed the fragile ego of that woman, guided only by pure, blind vanity. The hurried lawyer collected the documents with a clumsy anxiety, almost snatching the white sheets from the calm hands of the woman who had just signed. He seemed genuinely haunted by the irrational fear that she might suddenly change her mind and tear everything up in a fit of rage and despair. With his glasses slipping down his sweaty nose, the man meticulously checked each signature to ensure all legal fields were correctly filled and valid. The malignant contract was now a concrete and totally incontestable legal reality. With impressive lightness, Isabel pushed back the upholstered chair and stood up, smoothing the folds of her modest dress with calculated, slow gestures. She swept her brilliant, cutting gaze over the three opponents watching her, radiating a magnificent confidence that quickly unsettled the atmosphere of that oppressive room. Instead of looking like an abandoned wife defeated by life's adversities, she exhibited the lethal posture of a fierce predator that had just toyed relentlessly with its meal. The initial shock began to sprout in their hearts. The young woman's sweet, restrained voice broke the silence with a simple, direct statement that she was leaving that suffocating property for good at that very moment. The tone used was almost an innocuous whisper. However, it carried an immense weight of undeniable authority that resonated mysteriously through the heavy, silent walls of the room. She looked directly into the matriarch's dark eyes and sincerely wished they would deeply enjoy all the direct and irrevocable consequences that this specific agreement would bring. An inexplicable chill suddenly ran down the cowardly lawyer's spine. A deep furrow appeared on Eleanor's wrinkled forehead, slightly annoyed by the total absence of tears or emotional outbursts she had eagerly awaited. The sadistic matriarch had prepared herself to savor hysterical screams, humiliating pleas, and the absolute despair of a woman who had just lost her safe harbor. That cold, indecipherable smile on her daughter-in-law's serene face caused a terrible discomfort, an agonizing feeling that something essential had escaped her view. However, she preferred to dismiss this feeling as mere psychological shock. Quickly regaining his usual aggressive posture, Richard openly mocked the enigmatic warning, brutally ordering her to grab her cheap suitcase and disappear from there at once. The heir scoffed at the obvious attempt to sound threatening, arrogantly asserting that the only real consequence of that paper would be his own happiness. He boasted that his immense wealth would now multiply infinitely, that the shackles of an inferior marriage had been broken forever by the astute claws of the law. His resounding ignorance was practically a tragic, foretold symphony. His blonde companion seized the hostile climate to entwine her long arms around her rich lover's neck, feigning a superiority she did not naturally possess. She blew a provocative and malicious kiss in Isabel's direction, celebrating an illusory triumph over the adversary who had just voluntarily abandoned the arena. The futile woman felt the taste of ultimate power, completely blind to the devastating storm already forming on the dark horizon of the Tan Empire. Their fall would be proportional to the height of their enormous displayed arrogance. Turning her back on the circus of human bizarre and egoism, the protagonist walked gracefully towards the heavy, carved oak doors that guarded the room. Her steps echoed on the polished floor with an impressive rhythmic firmness, marking the countdown to the monumental destruction of those horrible and ungrateful people hidden there. She cast no melancholy glance backward, banishing the grand mansion and its despicable inhabitants from her shielded mind with extreme and admirable ease. Her sharp intellect was already focusing solely on the next strategic phase. As she crossed the threshold of the main door, the cold, refreshing night wind hit her delicate face like a long-awaited baptism of spiritual renewal. She paused at the top of the grand white marble staircase for a brief, silent moment, absorbing the atmosphere of absolute freedom she had brilliantly conquered. The weight of maintaining a pathetic facade finally vanished from her slender shoulders, allowing her true essence as an incontestable leader to flourish in the dark. Revenge had never seemed so pure, just, and wonderfully refreshing before. That humiliating piece of paper never represented a personal or financial defeat, but rather a necessary tactical amputation for the survival of her grand and hidden empire. By forcing the immediate removal of her name from the Tan family's decaying funds, the matriarch had cut the only existing link between their illusory assets and reality. Eleanor had acted perfectly, according to the master plan, freeing her brilliant daughter-in-law from immense hidden debts and transferring full ownership of the assets. The final masterstroke was executed by the impatient hands of the great villains themselves. Maintaining the impeccable calm that characterized her, Isabel took her mobile phone from the hidden pocket of her dark skirt and unlocked the screen with a swift movement. She quickly typed a short, encrypted message to her most trusted and highly trained executive assistant. Phase 1 completed with absolute and resounding operational success in enemy territory. The direct order to initiate the total freeze of the remaining assets crossed the servers in silent milliseconds through the great metropolis's cyberspace. The receipt confirmation lit up on the bright screen almost immediately, as if magically synchronized with the sending of the lethal order. A completely black, armored luxury car glided silently up the meticulously arranged gravel driveway. The imposing vehicle stopped exactly at the foot of the last step, where the young woman stood, openly challenging the territorial dominance of that property that housed weak minds. A uniformed driver quickly exited the front seat with extreme respect, opening the rear door with a reverence befitting the true and powerful financial master. The world was about to know Isabel's hidden strength. The driver in the dark suit closed the door gently as soon as Isabel settled into the impeccable leather seat. The armored vehicle's soundproofing immediately blocked out any noise from the oppressive mansion left behind. She sighed deeply, feeling 3 years of accumulated tension slide off her shoulders like dust, swept away by the wind. The mask of a submissive, vulnerable wife melted away completely, replaced by a sharp, cold, and absolutely dominant expression. The glint in her dark eyes reflected the mind of a true predator at the top of the corporate food chain. In the front seat, her loyal executive assistant turned slightly to hand her a latest generation tablet. The bright screen displayed complex graphs and countless financial transactions occurring in real time on the world's major stock exchanges. Isabel slid her fingers over the strategic information, analyzing the flow of capital with frightening speed and precision. She requested a glass of sparkling water while changing from her simple flats into exclusive designer high heels. The visual transformation perfectly matched the reclaiming of her true place as the most powerful mind in the market. The luxury car accelerated smoothly through the tree-lined streets of the elite neighborhood, leaving the Tan family property smaller and smaller in the distance. Isabel watched the mansion's high gates through the tinted window, aware that the gilded cage now belonged entirely to her. Eleanor and Richard believed they were ousting an unwanted pest, ignorant that they had only accelerated the process of their own destruction. Their blind arrogance had served as an extremely useful tool throughout the entire process of silently acquiring the company's debts. The Proud family's final destiny was already sealed in virtual vaults. For the last 3 dark years, no one had suspected that the despised daughter-in-law was the founder of the largest clandestine investment holding. Under the facade of a fragile, resourceless woman, Isabel operated a colossal financial empire from her own remote office. Whenever her incompetent husband plunged the family businesses into unpayable debt, it was her anonymous holding company that injected rescue capital. She had silently bought up all the promissory notes, mortgages, and controlling shares that Richard desperately offered to ruthless creditors from the globalized and extremely dangerous financial underworld. With every stupid mistake Richard made during his gambling nights or disastrous business decisions, Isabel expanded her domain. She structured a complex web of shell companies that patiently absorbed every drop of the Proud matriarch's tangible assets. Eleanor Tan's name still appeared on the factory signs, but the actual deeds rested in the impenetrable vaults of her silent daughter-in-law. By signing that divorce document filled with idiotic demands, the corrupt lawyers had removed the only legal barrier preventing the definitive transfer of all valuable assets. The imposing black vehicle finally parked in front of a glass skyscraper, mirrored in the financial heart of the great metropolis. The gigantic building, crowned with the discreet logo of her global corporation, pulsed like the nerve center of a tireless organism. Private security guards immediately formed a protective corridor, awaiting the exit of the woman who controlled thousands of destinies with a single order. Isabel disembarked with a majestic posture, radiating an aura of unquestionable power that her old mother-in-law could never imitate, even with all the jewels in the world. As she passed through the automatic doors of the majestic lobby, dozens of highly qualified employees bowed their heads in a sign of deep respect. No one there saw the offended young woman who served coffee to arrogant guests at the Tan mansion just a few hours ago. They saw only the ruthless strategist who built a billion-dollar empire from absolute zero with her own analytical genius. The firm sound of her footsteps on the black marble floor echoed like a march of anticipated victory, announcing the official start of a new and merciless corporate era. The private elevator shot silently towards the top floor, where the spacious penthouse offered a stunning panoramic view of the entire city. Isabel entered her sanctuary of power, a minimalist environment decorated with contemporary art and global monitoring screens. Her chief financial officer was already waiting patiently beside a solid glass table, holding folders full of recent audits and finalized contracts. The loyal man broke into a wide smile upon noticing the relieved and triumphant expression on his boss's face, understanding that the day of reckoning had arrived. The brilliant leader tossed her handbag onto the designer armchair and immediately requested a full update on their operational status. The director handed her a detailed report, confirming that the divorce documentation had already been digitally intercepted by their lawyers. The automatic validation of the predatory clauses had triggered the pre-established contractual triggers in the hidden debts incurred by the stupid heir. As her name had been intentionally removed from all shared responsibilities by the selfish matriarch, the real guarantees were executed instantly and transferred in their entirety to the company's exclusive control. Isabel sat in her dark leather presidential chair, lacing her fingers in her lap as she analyzed the impressive numbers. The centuries-old Tan estate, once a source of so much vanity and humiliation against her, was now just another green line on her balance sheets. The demand that she leave with nothing was the rope they had used to hang themselves in the definitive legal abyss. Without the legal protection of matrimony, the phantom creditors, all secretly controlled by her, possessed the irrevocable right to immediately confiscate the main properties. Without wasting a single second, she ordered the tech team to trigger the immediate freeze of all their bank accounts. Richard's platinum credit cards were to be declined in every machine in the country, starting that very rainy night. The access passwords to the investment funds managed by the presumptuous mother-in-law would be revoked, citing serious irregularities in the capital's composition. Isabel wanted them to feel the paralyzing despair of losing everything suddenly, exactly as they had tried to do to her with that cursed contract signed with mocking laughter. The executive assistant confirmed that the foreclosure proceedings for the productive plantations and commercial buildings were already filed in court. The on-duty night judges had approved the injunctions with surprising speed, given the indisputable solidity of the documentary evidence attached by the legal team. The majestic mansion, where Eleanor was planning her future parties, was formally registered as the wholly owned property of the Silent Foreign Investment Holding. Any attempt at sale or transfer by the family would be considered serious criminal fraud, subjecting the supposed owners to pre-trial detention and widespread public shame. A feeling of absolute liberation invaded the protagonist's soul as she watched the city's bright lights through the enormous window. It had been 3 long years of enduring her mother-in-law's venomous insults to protect a secret investigation into money laundering within the group. Richard wasn't just an incompetent idiot. He was using the family structure to conceal criminal diversions that threatened to destroy thousands of innocent jobs. Isabel's patience had prevented a severe regional economic collapse, allowing her to sanitize the assets before delivering the fatal blow to the true culprits. Recalling the scene of the new blonde mistress, suggesting she donate old clothes, a soft, genuine laugh escaped her perfect lips. That superficial woman was celebrating the gain of an empty title, tying her image to a rapidly sinking ship. The reality check that awaited them would be brutal, crushing their illusions of superiority under the undeniable weight of absolute and imminent bankruptcy. The outside world still saw the Tan family as the untouchable royalty of the economy, but the true queen had already severed the heads of all the traitors. The office's main screen flashed with red alerts, confirming that the central bank directors had complied with the issued court orders. Access to physical vaults and offshore accounts was hermetically sealed by state financial security agents. Isabel slowly swiveled her presidential chair, savoring the sweet taste of justice perfectly executed without spilling a single drop of blood. Her most powerful weapon was never empty aggression, but rather a profound and silent mastery of the legal system and the psychological flaws of her vain and arrogant adversaries. The CFO informed her that an official eviction notice for the main mansion was already being prepared by court bailiffs. The notice would be delivered directly into the old matriarch's hands the next morning, ruining the celebratory breakfast she had planned. Isabel instructed her team to ensure the elite financial press received anonymous tips about the suspicious movements of the suddenly bankrupt ex-billionaires. The destruction of that unbridled arrogance needed to be public so that the old family name would lose any remnant of power or influence within high society. A soft chime sounded through the room's discreet speakers, indicating the closing of the global financial market. The financial genius poured herself a glass of rare vintage red wine, toasting to the tranquil silence of her sanctuary. Her tortuous journey infiltrated in the snake's den was over, resulting in a monumental victory that would go down in secret corporate history. She reflected on how systematic underestimation had been the perfect tool that paved the wide road to her solitary and incontestable ascent to power. Dawn advanced through the deserted streets, while the new mistress of the empire meticulously reviewed each step of the corporate restructuring plan. The honest workers in the Tan factories would suffer no impact, as she had already secured reserve funds in safe accounts. The severe punishment would fall exclusively on the foolish shoulders of those who confused cruelty with power and disdain with true mental sophistication. Isabel smiled enigmatically at the starry horizon, aware that the sun would rise on a completely new kingdom, where justice finally wore her beautiful, implacable face. The atmosphere in the imposing Tan family mansion overflowed with an artificial and exaggerated joy during the luxurious night of celebration. Eleanor had organized a magnificent event to commemorate what she considered the greatest victory of her brilliant life. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the main hall, where dozens of high society guests toasted with exorbitant champagne. The matriarch wore an exclusive haute couture gown, flaunting a glittering diamond necklace to outshine any memory of the unwanted past. The climate of arrogance and triumph seemed completely unshakable under those bright lights. Richard proudly circulated through the immense hall with his new romantic conquest, who paraded gracefully by his right side. The blonde woman wore a golden dress that attracted all the envious and curious glances of the millionaires present at the grand party. The incompetent heir boasted loudly about the supposed record profits the family businesses would have in the next fiscal quarter. He drank generous glasses of imported wine, completely immersed in an illusion of unshakable greatness and unlimited power. The couple's mediocrity was applauded by professional sycophants seeking advantageous business favors. Surrounded by a closed circle of rich and futile friends, the old matriarch bragged about the overwhelming success of the one-sided divorce. Eleanor completely distorted the facts, recounting with enormous sadistic pleasure how her ex-daughter-in-law left empty-handed. She laughed loudly as she described the submissive and pathetic signature on the document that supposedly protected the Tan's historic fortune. The gossiping guests agreed with enthusiastic nods, praising the old lady's brilliant shrewdness in preserving the pure lineage of financial nobility. The collective ignorance of that decadent elite formed a fragile, temporary shield. The first real sign that the storm had begun to break appeared discreetly at the back of the ballroom. The event's lavish organizer approached with extreme hesitation, whispering in the arrogant Richard's ear about a small technical problem. The corporate credit card, with its supposedly infinite limit, had been severely declined by the International Central Bank during the final payment. Annoyed by the banal interruption, the heir huffed loudly and handed over a second platinum card with rough, impatient gestures. He demanded the employee resolve the issue quickly, without bothering him again. A torturous 15 minutes passed before the organizer returned, pale and visibly trembling with fear before his boss. The second card also showed a fatal error message, indicating a complete block on all active financial functions. Richard felt his face burn with fury and contained shame, apologizing to his new rich girlfriend with a forced smile. He marched furiously towards the mansion's private study, muttering heavy curses against the supposed incompetence of the bank managers. The black abyss was already beginning to open slowly beneath his luxurious feet. Locked inside the silent study, far from the festive laughter of high society, the heir turned on his state-of-the-art computer. His agile fingers repeatedly typed the master passwords for direct access to the billion-dollar funds that guaranteed the family's unrestrained luxury. A brightly flashing red screen informed him that the entered credentials had no legal validity or permission to consult the million-dollar balances. A sudden, inexplicable chill ran up his arrogant spine as he desperately tried to access a secondary international account. The system's response was identical, relentlessly cold and destructive. In the stunning main hall, the impatient matriarch noticed the prolonged absence of her dear son and principal heir. Eleanor excused herself from her fawning friends and walked firmly through the corridors decorated with priceless art. She found Richard staring blankly at the bright monitor with wide, terrified eyes and his mouth partly open. The old lady asked sharply about the reason for this childish behavior of hiding during his own triumphant celebration party. The defeated man's trembling voice replied that the banks had mysteriously cut off his lines of credit. The matriarch let out a loud, disdainful laugh, classifying the dramatic situation as a mere trivial system error. She firmly believed her gigantic influence over the financial market would resolve any bureaucratic inconvenience with a simple late-night phone call. Eleanor ordered her son to stop his ridiculous behavior immediately and return to the brilliant, festive hall. She took out her own jewel-encrusted mobile phone to call the president of their allied central bank directly. The number rang repeatedly, with no response from the powerful executive. The tense atmosphere in the study was suddenly broken by the frightening crash of the heavy oak door being violently thrown open. The Tan Group's chief counsel ran into the luxurious room, sweating coldly and holding a huge, stuffed black briefcase. His Italian silk tie was crooked, and his face wore the grim expression of a condemned man about to die. He completely ignored the old matriarch's furious shouts of protest and threw a pile of legal documents onto the table. Total Ruin had arrived to collect the overdue bill. The breathless lawyer tried to organize his words as he frantically pointed to the bank statements issued during that chaotic and dark morning. He informed them with a choked voice that a sudden external audit had blocked all access to the main holding company's physical properties. The signatures and legal seals used by Richard for the past 3 years had completely lost their immediate executive validity. A phantom international corporation had executed the secretly accumulated debts and assumed immediate control of the proud Tan family's tangible assets. The words fell like giant stones on their shoulders. Eleanor slammed her clenched fist furiously on the printed papers, accusing the loyal old lawyer of treason and unacceptable slander. She screamed hysterically that they possessed absolute liquidity to pay off any phantom debt that magically appeared. The old lady demanded to know the name of the person responsible for this absurd financial attack that had ruined her perfect night of wonderful celebration. The lawyer shook his head negatively with extreme sadness, revealing that the hidden contracts allowed for judicial seizure without any prior notice. The real nightmare was just beginning to reveal its claws. Richard collapsed into the soft leather chair, sweating profusely as the loose pieces of the puzzle began to form a terrible picture. He questioned in a tone of pure panic whether his humble ex-wife's divorce signature had any correlation with this. The lawyer swallowed hard before confirming that the malicious document had, in fact, left them unprotected against highly aggressive, hostile investors. By legally removing Isabel's name from all debts and corporate ties, they had accidentally transferred the entire venomous burden onto their own vulnerable and fully exposed shoulders. The matriarch's arrogance violently rejected the idea that her hated, useless ex-daughter-in-law could have orchestrated such an intellectual trap. Eleanor raged that it was impossible, as the classless girl would never possess the brilliant mind required for such complex manipulation. She fiercely blamed invisible business partners, who were supposedly taking advantage of the Tan dynasty's sensitive moment of family transition. The old blindness prevented the presumptuous lady from seeing the lethal poison she herself had lovingly cultivated within her own majestic residence. Hubris had perfectly preceded their total ruin. The study door was slowly opened by hands with long, artificially extended nails painted a very flashy and vulgar bright red. Richard's new mistress entered the room, showing deep irritation at being suddenly abandoned in the middle of the chic and brilliant party. She demanded a stern explanation from her millionaire partner, wanting to know why the expensive drinks had magically stopped being served to the hungry and thirsty guests. The superficial woman quickly noticed the atmosphere thick with silent death and destruction that filled the dark room. Her beautiful smile froze in a very strange way, completely destabilized by the monumental catastrophe. The irresponsible heir unloaded all his frustrated fury on his new vain and demanding companion. Richard screamed frighteningly for her to get out of the private room immediately, insulting her superficiality in a cowardly and extremely vile manner. The blonde mistress retreated, indignant at the irrational outburst, promising to destroy the bankrupt man's reputation before the entire gossiping social elite of the metropolis. The false love, which had seemed unshakable just hours before, crumbled instantly at the first visible signs of imminent financial poverty. Alliances driven only by greed collapsed very quickly. A sepulchral silence abruptly descended upon the colossal property, when the live music from the main orchestra was suddenly cut off in the hall. Through the heavy slits of the dark study's armored window, Eleanor could see unidentified black vans blocking the main entrance. Men in dark suits, carrying official documents, walked with hurried, determined steps across the impeccably manicured lawn of the luxurious mansion. The glamorous party transformed into a perfect scene of widespread panic as the elitist guests fled, fearing investigations or dangerous retaliations. The brilliant illusion cruelly evaporated before the sad reality of watching the fleet of federal agents and financial auditors ruthlessly approaching the grand, centennial, and majestic wrought iron gates. The experienced and elderly lawyer silently gathered his own valuable personal documents, preparing his discreet and rapid escape from that tragic stage. He turned his back on his former presumptuous clients and formally declared his irrevocable and instantaneous resignation from their corporate and personal services. The astute man knew perfectly how to recognize the cold ashes of a great empire, destroyed by the burning flames of continued and lethal human arrogance. There was no possible salvation for them there. Alone in the luxurious environment that no longer legally belonged to them, mother and son shared a moment of deep and terrible absolute panic. Eleanor fell roughly into the expensive cushioned armchair, pressing her trembling fingers against her aching chest while she gasped urgently for pure oxygen. Richard whimpered pathetically in a dark corner of the luxurious room, pulling at his own gelled hair in an absurd fit of immense and suffocating despair. The invisible fortress that protected the perverse minds of those two cruel monsters was demolished without using a single drop of aggressive brute force. The invisible war was finally settled. The next morning dawned grimly over the luxurious property that once represented the supreme and untouchable power of the influential Tan family. The silence inside the gigantic mansion was deafening, broken only by the hurried and desperate steps of the few servants packing their own bags. Eleanor staunchly refused to accept the shameful defeat imposed by invisible forces during the chaotic night, filled with indescribable public humiliations. Wearing an impeccable, elegant dark suit, the old matriarch prepared her proud spirit for a bloody and relentless bureaucratic battle in the financial institutions. Dragging her cowardly son from his luxurious bed with shrill screams and cruel insults, the old lady demanded immediate and brutal action. Richard's eyes were sunken and red, exuding a strong smell of alcohol and total despair in the face of the catastrophe he himself had secretly caused. They hired an expensive new criminal lawyer by phone, promising exorbitant fees they no longer possessed, to try to reverse the abruptly established nightmare. The exhausted driver drove them quickly towards the monumental headquarters of the central bank, located in the cold heart of the metropolitan city. As they crossed the revolving glass doors of the International Bank, the special treatment they always received had completely vanished. There were no smiling managers waiting with cups of gourmet coffee or receptionists offering privileged seats in the soft, expensive, imported Italian leather armchairs. Eleanor marched furiously to the main service counter, demanding with extreme arrogance to speak directly with the executive director of that giant financial institution. The frightened attendant asked them to wait patiently in the common area, an unforgivable offense to the decadent matriarch's gigantic ego. After 30 torturous minutes of humiliating waiting, the director received them in a cold room, without offering any friendly greeting. He opened a bulky folder on the meeting table, displaying a rigid and professional posture, completely insensitive to the old lady's tantrums. The executive explained in a monotonous voice that the bank accounts associated with the Tan Empire were empty and legally frozen by severe court orders. All million-dollar lines of credit were definitively suspended due to the immediate execution of guarantees tied to colossal, fully defaulted international loans. Richard began to sweat coldly and tremble uncontrollably as the director displayed the detailed statements of secret transactions from the last 3 years. The document proved that the irresponsible heir had borrowed mountains of money from a mysterious investment holding based overseas. These obscure funds were used exclusively to cover the enormous financial holes caused by disastrous bets, terrible investments, and a life of absurd luxuries. The bank executive cruelly pointed out that the bank had only complied with the confiscation orders issued by the sole sovereign creditor of those tainted accounts. The proud matriarch slammed the glass table violently, hysterically denying the contracts signed by her own stupid son. Eleanor screamed at the top of her lungs that her family's prestigious surname held inestimable value and could never be subjugated by unknown foreign creditors. The director sighed patiently, pushing forward copies of the original contracts that displayed Richard's trembling and hurried handwriting on every compromising and lethal page. The incontestable reality of the numbers mercilessly crushed any illusory argument sustained by the blind vanity of that terribly arrogant woman. Realizing that the central bank was a lost cause, the old lady grabbed her paralyzed son's arm and dragged him out of the glass building. She decided to focus her aggressive energy on preserving the historic real estate, believing the land records would protect them from absolute bankruptcy. The newly hired lawyer met them at the door of the city's main land registry office, holding a small black genuine leather briefcase. Eleanor's desperate hope lay in the centuries-old deed to the immense mansion where she had always lived, reigning absolutely. The atmosphere of the public registry office was chaotic, noisy, and filled with ordinary people resolving banal and extremely monotonous bureaucratic problems daily. For the elitist matriarch, mixing her majestic presence with lower-class citizens was the worst possible psychological torture on that cursed day. She brutally cut the line, ignoring the indignant protests of the people around her, and threw her identity documents onto the scared attendant's worn-out counter. She immediately demanded the certificates of ownership for all commercial properties, productive plantations, and luxurious residences linked to the crumbled conglomerate. The public servant slowly typed the data into the antiquated system, while Eleanor tapped her nails impatiently on the scratched and dirty counter. When the results appeared on the bright screen, the man's face turned visibly pale, and he printed the certificates with trembling hands. The criminal lawyer pulled the warm sheets from the printer and began to read the legal content with an expression of deep and growing shock. He informed them, in a choked voice, that absolutely all of the family's properties, including the main mansion, had been placed under fiduciary alienation months ago. Panic completely dominated the environment as the lawyer explained the cruel and perfectly legal mechanics of that devastating, meticulously crafted contractual trap. The clauses written into the secret mortgages stipulated that any change in Richard's marital structure would trigger the immediate transfer of the properties given as collateral. By forcing the silent daughter-in-law to sign that abusive divorce the previous night, they had pulled the trigger on their own total and unrestricted real estate destruction. The document that excluded the innocent girl's name served perfectly to isolate the valuable, clean assets far away from them. Eleanor felt a violent dizziness threaten her precarious balance, leaning heavily against the cold wall of the old registry's dirty corridor. She began to understand the true proportions of the monumental disaster brilliantly architected in the shadows during all those years of supposedly peaceful coexistence. The lawyer continued reading the terrifying documents, revealing that the absolute holder of all debts and mortgages was a single giant corporation. The name of the international investment conglomerate seemed vaguely familiar, awakening dark and disturbing memories in the powerful, defeated lady's confused mind. Richard collapsed to his knees on the filthy floor of the crowded registry office, crying copiously like a frightened child who had just broken a very expensive toy. The spoiled heir confessed through his sobs that he had transferred all the company's controlling shares to this mysterious foreign holding. He had faithfully believed he was saving the business from imminent bankruptcy through easy loans provided by anonymous and extremely generous investors. His profound ignorance of basic finance had handed the family's centuries-old empire on a platter to the most ruthless predators of the globalized market. A primitive and uncontrollable hatred completely took over the old matriarch's fragile body. Hearing her own son's pathetic and humiliating confession, she raised her wrinkled hand, adorned with expensive rings, and delivered a violent slap across the man's tear-streaked, kneeling face. The sound of the blow echoed loudly through the silent hall, physically marking the definitive destruction of the family ties that once sustained that powerful financial dynasty. Eleanor cursed the day she entrusted her late husband's glorious empire into the hands of that useless idiot. The criminal lawyer took a few steps back, clearly embarrassed by the monumental public spectacle put on by the bankrupt elite. He put the lethal documents back in his dark briefcase, declaring in a cold, professional manner that no legal miracles were possible here. The contracts had validated digital signatures, notarization in international registries, and were perfectly shielded against any attempt at annulment in the Supreme Court. The transfer of the gigantic estate was a consummated and irreversible fact, leaving the family with nothing but unpayable debts and a huge, imminent scandal. To worsen the already unbearable agony, the lawyer explained the brutal side effects of the separation agreement signed the night before, amidst intense euphoria. As the ex-wife's exclusion was written in a broad and absolute manner at the arrogant matriarch's own demand, she came out completely unscathed. Isabel was perfectly shielded from the corporate bankruptcy proceedings that would now fall exclusively on the shoulders of Richard and his old mother. The sadistic and petty demand to cut her out of the inheritance had saved the young woman from sinking along with that miserable ship. A terrifying and dreadful clarity began to invade Eleanor's brilliant and malevolent mind as she pieced together the crucial parts of the gigantic puzzle. The endless late nights the daughter-in-law spent locked in her study, using a heavily encrypted computer, finally made absolute and frightening sense. Now, Isabel's submissive and passive silence was never a sign of emotional weakness, but rather the perfect camouflage of a genius financial predator in operation. The arrogant matriarch realized she had harbored her own ruthless executioner under her own luxurious roof. The floor seemed to melt under Eleanor's expensive shoes, as her blood pressure skyrocketed dangerously within her rigid and aged veins. The images of the previous night flashed through her fragmented memory like tormenting snapshots, highlighting the indecipherable and icy smile of the woman they had humiliated. The old lady violently rejected the repulsive idea that the poor girl from the heartlands had outmaneuvered the superior intellect of the entire aristocratic dynasty. The villain's unbridled pride prevented a peaceful acceptance, forcing her mind to the brink of a complete collapse. With clenched teeth and eyes overflowing with a psychotic fury, Eleanor rudely ordered the useless lawyer to call her private driver immediately. She refused to fall into the anonymity of extreme poverty without first looking directly into the eyes of the phantom president of that destructive investment conglomerate. The old matriarch swore bloody revenge against the cursed corporation, blindly believing that her authoritarian tone of voice would reverse the immutable laws of capitalism. A light rain began to fall outside, washing the streets of the merciless city. Richard remained seated on the cold floor of the registry office, hugging his own knees while muttering incoherently about his beloved new girlfriend who had vanished. Eleanor ignored her cowardly son's pathetic state, forcing her majestic posture as she walked towards the luxury car parked outside. The final destination of that turbulent and revealing morning would be the imposing, glass-clad headquarters of the gigantic corporate group that dared to usurp her former sovereign reign. The direct confrontation was set, paving the dark path towards the definitive shock that would shatter the last of her grandiose illusions. The imposing building of glass and steel reflected the grey light of the rainy morning, rising like an unshakable monolith in the financial center of the enormous modern metropolis. Eleanor stepped out of the luxury car with heavy steps, ignoring the cold drops that were ruining her meticulously styled hair. She walked towards the large revolving doors with the rigid posture of an enraged queen marching to reclaim her stolen crown. The old matriarch firmly believed her mere authoritarian presence would be enough to intimidate any arrogant executive of that abusive and phantom financial conglomerate. The main lobby, exuded a silent wealth and an absurd technological prowess, contrasting sharply with the old, musty decor of the Tan dynasty's mansion. The old lady marched to the gleaming reception desk, demanding in a loud, shrill voice to speak immediately with the president responsible for that criminal investment organization. Dark-suited security guards approached cautiously, but the elegant receptionist just smiled with extreme coolness and professional courtesy, informing her that the president's office was already expecting her illustrious visit. Eleanor felt a terrible pang of unease at this unexpected ease of access to the highest executive level. The panoramic elevator ascended silently through dozens of illuminated floors, revealing the vastness of the chaotic metropolis below through the thick glass walls. The arrogant matriarch clutched her expensive handbag, mentally rehearsing speeches of hatred and threats of billion-dollar lawsuits. She imagined meeting an old market shark or an inexperienced young heir, trying to play at dominating the traditional corporate and real estate empire with low tricks. Blind ignorance still protected her from the overwhelming impact that awaited her at the end of that dizzying ascent towards the apex of absolute power. The metal doors opened smoothly on the impeccable top floor, revealing a gigantic space of minimalist architecture and contemporary art decorations of the highest value. The suited executive assistant guided the enraged woman to the massive dark mahogany door of the presidency, opening the way for the final, definitive confrontation. Eleanor stormed into the enormous presidential office with heavy steps, spewing loud curses and demanding the immediate reversal of all fraudulent confiscation actions. She stopped abruptly in the middle of the plush carpet, when the black leather chair slowly turned to reveal her great, merciless tormentor. Seated majestically in the imposing executive leather armchair, wearing an impeccable dark-tailored suit and sporting a chilling, unforgettable smile, was her vastly underestimated ex-daughter-in-law. Isabel clasped her hands on the glass desk with a cutting serenity, exuding an aura of absolute supremacy that froze the blood in the old mother-in-law's veins. The elderly woman's almond-shaped eyes widened as she gasped loudly, trying to process the absolutely impossible sight of the humble girl occupying the throne of the billion-dollar empire. The abrupt paradigm shift struck the villain's brain with incredible physical force. A disconnected, harsh murmur escaped Eleanor's dry lips as she hysterically refused to accept the monstrous reality unfolding before her terrified eyes. She pointed a trembling, bejeweled finger towards the presidential desk, accusing Isabel of breaking into the building to try and unjustly deceive the decadent noble family. The matriarch screamed almost demonically, stating categorically that a lower-class woman could never orchestrate the financial collapse of that gigantic, invincible, centuries-old empire. The pathetic denial was the last psychological trench of a mind terribly poisoned by strong, blind vanity. Isabel's melodious and terribly firm voice echoed through the vastness of the chic office, silencing the old tyrant's desperate bellows with extreme verbal ease. The young president revealed with millimetric coldness that she had founded this gigantic global investment corporation long before meeting the useless heir of the bankrupt Tans. She calmly recounted how she had observed Richard's criminal diversions and total financial amateurism, deciding to secretly buy up every tiny fraction of debt he irresponsibly incurred. The poison of truth dripped from her brilliantly articulated words, corroding the fragile foundations of that tyrannical woman. With a simple, agile touch on the integrated light control panel on her desk, the genius strategist projected several confidential documents onto the large screen on the main wall. The irrefutable digital evidence detailed every act of dark corruption, dirty money laundering, and criminal tax evasion committed under the matriarch's mediocre and shameful leadership. Isabel coldly highlighted the exact moment the family had handed over absolute control of their assets by signing the divorce contract the previous festive night. The legal trap had marvelously shielded the brilliant young woman from the family's various horrendous crimes. Isabel leaned her body slightly forward, fixing an implacable, condemnatory gaze on the teary and terrified eyes of the woman who had psychologically tortured her for years. She explained that the disguise of a submissive and humble wife was essential to monitor the frauds and protect the thousands of innocent workers employed in the group's gigantic factories. The billionaire leader ironically pointed out that the old mother-in-law's unbridled arrogance and profound ignorance were the primary instruments of her own destructive success. The systematic underestimation had provided the perfect and fundamental fog to cover her advance. Every word uttered by the incontestable queen of the financial market sounded like the heavy strike of a judicial gavel, irrevocably condemning the decadent old villain. Eleanor finally understood the devastating enormity of her tragic, strategic, and existential error in ruthlessly underestimating an intellect vastly superior to her own limited intelligence. The damned abusive separation contract she had sadistically imposed did not represent the expulsion of the unwanted daughter-in-law, but rather the irreversible death certificate of the dynasty. The unbearable and gigantic weight of lethal guilt instantly collapsed upon her old shoulders. The sharp perception that her absolute ruin had been perfectly orchestrated by the humiliated poor girl triggered a violent short circuit in that elderly, proud, and decadent mind. Eleanor desperately tried to articulate one last offense of pure hatred, but her chest tightened painfully, stealing all the remaining oxygen from her fragile lungs, punished by paralyzing panic. The old lady wore an expression of pure dread and enormous disbelief, before suddenly losing all physical strength and finally succumbing to the overwhelming, destructive shock. She staggered backward, awkwardly, and collapsed inertly onto the beautiful plush carpet. Isabel watched the pathetic and dramatic fall of her worst torturous enemy, without altering even a tiny facial muscle, in a sign of unfounded compassion or non-existent remorse. The brilliant young executive very calmly pressed the luminous internal communication button on the massive desk, ordering the excellent corporate medical team to provide due assistance immediately. There was no kind of sadistic malice in her majestic, icy attitude, only the extremely cold and very rational execution of a truly deserved and balanced justice. The long and exhaustive silent war was wonderfully and finally concluded. The agile uniformed paramedics invaded the chic room, rushing to help the frightened, collapsed woman, placing the proud old evil queen on a simple stretcher with standardized, metric efficiency. As the gleaming doors of the luxury elevator closed quickly, taking away the last bodily remnants of the arrogant, fallen dynasty, the true mistress calmly returned to her desk. The brilliant game was definitively won, and the enormous corporate chessboard was beautifully cleared of several useless or dangerously toxic pieces for the economy. Isabel breathed the victorious air with her strong, beautiful, clean lungs. Richard's terrible fate was already being meticulously sealed behind the legal scenes, while his elderly mother was rushed to the tense municipal emergency room. The brilliant corporate lawyers filed strongly substantiated complaints with various federal agencies, delivering complete reports of evasion caused by the criminal and also incompetent, useless heir. Without the robust billion-dollar financial shield or the protective genius intelligence of his underestimated wife, the man would be harshly hunted and prosecuted by the strict authorities, without any mercy. The grand and supreme ethical justice would prevail. Looking thoughtfully at the vast urban expanses through the grand, luxurious panoramic windows, the unbeatable president reflected on the true and horrible human corruption constantly fueled by money. The immense accumulated wealth was never the true lethal poison, but rather the absolute absence of kind empathy for subordinate people. She used the intense and constant irrational greed of those arrogant, presumptuous magnates as a weapon and primary lever to finally dethrone their old and ailing, structurally failed criminal system. The gigantic triumph did not merely represent a small psychological revenge. The structural business transition of the immense and numerous valuable factories occurred in a very smooth and perfectly orchestrated manner by the experienced and efficient executive directors of highest and blind professional technical trust. Absolutely no hardworking laborer on the long production lines lost their valuable, essential job to feed their humble family. Isabel astutely shielded all the enormous and precious honest manual labor positions, while the company's billion-dollar ceiling fell, heavily crushing the rotten nobility. Her brilliantly surgical revenge punished and extracted exclusively the horrible accumulated moral decay. The calming silence returned to reign majestically throughout the luxurious extent of the immense and chic office of the new international presidency. Isabel gently poured a very small dose of the most expensive aged whiskey, toasting in a deliciously solitary act to the splendid and promising birth of a very strong and innovative ethical era. The former wounded woman, who only heard countless silent humiliations, had in fact died on that distant sofa, giving birth to the most legendary mythical executive. The complex and grand game of corporate chess ended with her wonderful, total glory. The dawn in the large and noisy metropolis brought with it refreshing winds of absolute change after the overwhelming storm that destroyed the entire proud Tan dynasty. The news of the monumental scandal and the irreversible bankruptcy of the once unshakable and feared noble family was emblazoned on the glossy cover of every major financial newspaper in the developed country. Televisions endlessly broadcasted the pathetic images of federal agents meticulously sifting through the corporate rubble of the fraudulent empire, which had perfectly collapsed under the unbearable weight of its own ignorance. The global corporate world slowly absorbed the terrible, invaluable shock, revering the admired. Richard woke up miserably in a cheap and incredibly dirty hotel room in the forgotten and utterly degraded suburbs of the enormous, merciless, and rainy city. The former billionaire heir was dressed in the same crumpled clothes from the terrible, tragic day before, sporting deep, dark circles under his eyes and an overwhelming despair that corroded his weak and empty soul. His newest and stunning blonde companion had mysteriously disappeared in the dead of the dark night, without warning, immediately blocking his phone number as soon as the catastrophic news broke. He was finally experiencing firsthand the terrible taste of total and humiliating invisibility. Feeling an uncontrollable panic suffocating his weak airways during the cold morning, the once arrogant man frantically called his former supposed friends, begging for urgent temporary asylum. Each of his desperate attempts resulted in harsh and very insensitive, immediate verbal refusals, or, in the vast majority of cases, sadly, in calls brutally ignored by his former great loyal allies. His shiny golden passport was revoked due to the judicial danger of imminent flight, and all his million-dollar international accounts had been definitively frozen by a strict police order. The black abyss had quickly devoured his world. On the other geographical side of that same bustling and surprising city during the first morning lights, the old lady slowly opened her very tired and confused eyes under the terrible, intense, artificial glare. Eleanor awoke completely disoriented inside the cold and incredibly cramped coronary unit of a poor public hospital, heavily crowded with patients thrown on hard stretchers in the long, narrow, noisy corridors. The luxurious and beautiful, exclusive, pure silk clothes, and also all the precious jewels inherited from her own arrogant family, had been legally confiscated without any mercy during the initial tense bureaucratic chaos. A very strong and almost piercing pain shot deep into the sad and arrogant elderly woman's weakened and embittered chest when the young and hurried on-duty doctor brusquely explained the poor, serious conditions of her long, forced provisional internment. There would be absolutely none of those long, wonderful transfers to the modern and super comfortable private clinics, always filled with expensive, famous brand-name pampering. The cold records of the unified state system sadly indicated the integral and definitive patrimonial ruin of the elderly woman's once sumptuous and legendary family finances. She tried to rage with immense furious revolt, using a fragile hoarseness, for the first striking and terrible time in her entire arrogant and immensely privileged, wonderful, earthly existence. Spent in an opulent, luxurious environment, Eleanor understood clearly, under a heavy, profound psychic shock, the crushing burden of the unbearable and new, absolute insignificance, cruelly imposed. She replayed in her mind, numerous times, the incredibly humiliating and terrifying short scenes experienced in the oppressive, spacious presidential office of the new, untouchable sovereign queen, perfectly recalling the frighteningly cold, deadly, lethal, unshakable, dangerous, and extremely serene facial expression of the implacable ex-relative, before blindly underestimated daily. The gigantic, presumptuous vanity of the wicked elderly matriarch had irreversibly ruined everything. The stunning and visible ethical contrast between the decrepit old criminal system and the new and promising transparent era managed by the brilliant young protagonist resplendently shone under the brilliant rays of the warm morning sun, touching the gigantic and majestic towers of the beautiful, bustling cosmopolitan metropolis, wonderfully and incredibly beautiful and imposing. Assuming the most coveted and envied chair in the entire extensive financial world, without any kind of limiting, suffocating, paralyzing, harmful fear, Isabel began to promote numerous and valuable revolutionary structural changes in all the rigid, archaic, outdated, bad, obsolete commercial processes that so unduly suffocated true talent, while the miserable and forgotten parasitic family that had judged her so much rotted away, trapped in the enormous snares of bitter, implacable, definitive, humiliating social oblivion. Our astute young heroine gloriously founded the thick columns of unbreakable gold, sustaining a new, highly profitable, virtuous, powerful, impeccable, strong, just, egalitarian, generous, and rich reality. The old and vast dirty empire was perfectly cleaned and sanitized, remade, modified, recovered, washed, rebuilt, purified, save from all that gigantic and heavy, dark, nefarious aura that the egocentric venomous snakes created over decades, stained, bloody, perverse, deceitful, manipulative, ignorant, abusive, and moral, disgusting, false, corrupted. In the calm and very pleasant silence, reassuring provided by the high and strong, expensive acoustic insulation of her beautiful and exquisite, formidable, giant, splendid, imposing minimalist office, the one and only unrivaled, indisputable, unbeatable, strong, supreme, superior queen of the market, finally freely offered a tiny and almost mysterious, enigmatic, triumphant smile. She rested her immaculate, smooth and fragrant, elegant, firm, soft, strong, perfect, divine hand on the cold, black top of the majestic, thick glass table, a brilliant, smooth, sparkling, crystal clear, impenetrable, beautiful reflector vaguely observing through the gleaming clear window the countless and distant, bright, sparkling, twinkling, yellow, colorful, vibrant, magical little lights, the impactful and dramatic, irreversible, dark, violent, fulminant, terrifying, and uncontrollable, severe, drastic, and brutal definitive ruin of those ignorant people, demonstrated with practical academic perfection that astute reasoning always easily surpasses all vulgar, empty, and pathetic forms, devoid of decent, strong, loyal human moral value. The cowardly, foolish man will rot solitarily in the merciless claws of the feared criminal judiciary, heavy, severe, vengeful, while his presumptuous and once millionaire elderly, malicious maternal figure suffers silently, miserably, and sick, begging for mere and few bitter, scarce, sad, insufficient, useless drops of strong pity from her old, invisible, past, dangerous, strong, fatal creditors. Many happy, prosperous, incredible, beautiful weeks naturally, organically, converted into excellent and majestic golden, productive, grand, magnificent months of deep and very rewarding, intense, tireless, valuable, vital, honest, ethical, courageous, strong, and formidable work in the main, isolated, absolute, admirable, incontestable, glorious, supreme, divine, brilliant, transparent, reputable, fantastic leadership. Isabel decided to widely apply part of the resounding wealth strategically inherited from the defeated corruption into formidable and vital, large, just charitable community social projects, focused specifically on empowering hundreds of brilliant, underestimated, neglected, forgotten, humiliated, unprotected, oppressed poor female students without a favorable, just, egalitarian, initial, decent, worthy, good, constructive, real human motivational opportunity. The unbreakable, powerful wheel of the rigorous capitalist system very easily forgave the violent, summary, and merciless exclusion of those amateur, incompetent, idiotic, ignorant, mediocre, rude, petty, cruel, deceitful, flawed, despicable, bankrupt, shameful, infamous, toxic, dirty, fallen, banned, eliminated, scratched, swept, erased, buried, crushed, forgotten, overcome, massacred, judged, destroyed, devoured, punished, exiled, humiliated, ruined, devastated, exposed, dishonored, prosecuted, ground-up criminals. The great and old hypocritical and dissembling, cunning, false, lying, egocentric, sycophantic business partners now ridiculously tried to bow desperately before the impressive golden dawn brought by the brilliant female majesty, unshakable, invincible, impenetrable, implacable, magnanimous, absolute, strong queen, unrivaled leader. The precious and most destructive paper, signed under dense malice and poisonous ignorance, symbolically, poetically, philosophically, ironically, masterfully, formidably, brilliantly, categorically, eternally, demonstrated that all the heavy and excessive hatred uttered with such empty, proud, sick, perverse, futile, malignant, vile, disgusting, unhappy arrogance always ends up building the gigantic, deep, exact, fatal, tragic, painful, inevitable, terrifying, dangerous, catastrophic, mortal fissure through which the foolish, blind, rude, ungrateful, cruel, ignorant, mediocre, idiotic executioners themselves plummet towards the sad void. Total, definitive, tenebrous, irremediable, cold, dark, bitter, desolate, silent, merciless, lethal, somber, oppressive, mortal, undeniable, hard, just, final, sad, ultimate, eternal oblivion.